difference.
Right. Okay. I'm going to read something, and forgive me, but
No.
I want to go here. You're face to face with God. Bone cancer in children. What's that about? How dare you? How dare you create a world where there is such misery? That's not our fault. It's utterly, utterly evil. Why should I respect a capricious, mean-minded, stupid God who creates a world so full of injustice and pain? And then one more, because the God who created this universe, if it was created by God, is quite clearly a maniac, utter maniac. Ivan in the Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
Right?
Absolutely.
Right. Now it's in, okay. So
Yes,
what
it's known
happens
as-
in the Brothers Karamazov is that Ivan wins the argument.
Yeah.
But Elosia is the better person.
Completely so. And we love him.
So it's,
yeah. It's a
right,
book
so it's
everyone
very
should
interesting.
read. I would urge everyone to read The Brothers Karamazov, because I do think it's a work of genius. There's a lot about Dostoevsky I really dislike because of his influences. Again, people who don't understand Dostoevsky think he's a champion of right-wing religiosity, without understanding that he went through an extraordinary life experience to come to where he did come, and that his novels show his full understanding of all kinds of different points of view. But in terms of the dialectic of that issue about how there can be a God, I mean, I was answering a question that I was asked.
I know, and I'm not trying. I'm not really not trying to put you on the spot.
My point is, I don't believe there is such a being. But if there were, and he were the kind of being that has been worshipped and described by various religions around the world, monotheistic religions, then I would have many bones to pick with him. But of course, I don't believe there is such a thing. But the argument from evil, as it's known, is a very old one, and it goes back through medieval religious figures as well as later humanists. That this idea that it is very hard to square this loving God who has knowledge of every hair on our head and adores us and adores little kittens, but he also, as I say, bone cancer in children, but also life cycles of insects whose whole aim is to burrow into the eyes of children in Africa and lay their eggs there and cause blindness for those children. I mean, you could quite easily picture a universe in which there weren't such an animal, and in which children were not sent blind with pain and horror by the various bugs and fungi and insects and viruses in the world. It isn't necessary.
There's a worm in Africa that burrows under the skin, and it's long worm. And if you can pull it out with a pencil and wrap it, but it breaks, it's fragile, and then it gets infected. It's a terrible thing. And a doctor recently made it his life's work to eradicate that, and did it successfully. Yeah. And so then I read what you wrote, and I mean, I take it very seriously, and I wasn't throwing it in your face. No. I brought it up actually because of what you said about Flaubert's attitude. You know, because what your statement lacks is exactly what Flaubert highlighted in that woman on her knees. And I'm not saying this is a simple solution, right? And I would say, so let's take the argument you made there. And there's a direction that goes in that's nihilistic and resentful and vengeful and angry and all understandable. Yes. But to me, it doesn't look to me like there's anything good in it. It looks like it's entirely counterproductive. It makes the problem it purports to have been generated by worse. Mm-hmm. So then the question is, what's the appropriate attitude, given that the argument you make is actually an extraordinarily powerful argument? And I don't know the answer to that, but I do know, I think, that resentment and anger, and even the motive that would make you want to say that to God himself, I think that's probably not helpful, even though it's so, well, I came to that with great difficulty. I mean, I've had my reasons to be resentful and angry, especially recently, and because I'm suffering a lot of pain. Yeah. And it makes me resentful and angry and wanting to shake my fist. Yeah. But I found upon intense consideration that there was nothing in that didn't make it worse, and that therefore that must be wrong. even though it's
agree.
justifiable, right?
Jordan, I completely understand. And you must remember that my response was to a question I didn't see coming, and it was amused. It was because I don't believe in this God. It's not an issue. I'm not really resentful and angry about the fact that there's evil in the world. I'm sorrowful very often, and I'm united in my admiration for the fact and the real belief I have that most people, fundamentally, given this dysfunction or this deep trauma, most people are so good, are so anxious to be good, are deontically good, have a sense of obligation and drive in them to be better than they are. I think that's one of the key things that I love about humanity, is not just that we are dissatisfied with things that are wrong and can be improved, but that with ourselves we are dissatisfied, and that most of us want to be better. I know that's true of me all the time. Every time I go off to sleep, I think, how did I screw up today? How can I be better tomorrow? Why am I so bad at this? If only I could manage that. In moral terms, genuine moral terms.
I think that's an extraordinarily common experience and very much under-noticed.
Yeah.
And part of the reason, as far as I can tell, that the talks that I've been giving, let's say, have had the effect that they've had is because I do point out that that's an extraordinarily common experience.
Yeah.
That self-torture by conscience. And it does indicate this striving towards a higher mode of being. The other question I have when I look at the response that I just read is that the amount of the world's evil that's a consequence of our voluntary moral insufficiencies is indeterminate. So you might say, hypothetically speaking, that as part of God's creation, we actually have important work to do. And if we shirk it, the consequences are real. Yeah. And you might say, well, that's just an apology for God. And perhaps that's the case. And perhaps there's no God at all. And so what the hell are we talking about? But I do think it's an important issue. I mean, your life is characterized by a stellar level of constant productive creativity. That's you, and you're offering that to the world, and that seems necessary. And maybe it's because the problems are real and important, and the role we have to play ethically is of paramount importance, truly.
Yeah.
Why else would we torture ourselves with conscience? And I would say that's the flowering of the religious instinct within you.
Well, you could describe it as that, but then, there are phrases. I mean, you used a phrase earlier that I wanted to say, whoa, hang on, I'm not sure I know what that means, a higher mode of existence. I don't see... I remember having this argument with John Cleese, of all people, some years ago. He was a great lover of the Tibetan Book of the Dead and Gilbran and people like that, and I've always found them slightly hard to take. And he talked about I think the phrase he used was a higher level of consciousness. And I said, I don't, and again, this is my empiricist thing. It sounds cynical and skeptical. It's not meant to be, but what level? Describe a level. What is a higher mode? Why higher? What's higher than another? Are you saying it in terms of animals? It's a view, it's an old-fashioned Huxleyan view of evolution that most modern, Richard Dawkins, for example, most modern evolutionary scientists and so on, the ethologists would deprecate, to say that there is a higher level of being, a higher mode of consciousness. Is it just like saying, well, you're better educated, you've read more, you know more? Is it you've somehow been enlightened, a Verklärungs effect, as the Germans would say, which is not necessarily intellectual, but is somehow spiritual? And if so, show me an example of it. Show me someone who has a higher mode of existence than I do. I
can answer that, I think, to some degree.
Yeah.
Three ways. One, that higher mode of existence is what your conscience tortures you for not attaining.
Right. Okay. I think
so
what my conscience tortures me for not attaining is that I was rude to someone yesterday and I shouldn't have been.
Right, but it's the shouldn't part of it.
Yes, the obligation. It's the
exactly.
David Hume, the problem of ought. Yeah.
Well, and then you think about how it manifests itself. You don't. This is why Nietzsche was wrong. You cannot create your own values.
Right.
The values impose themselves on you independent of your will. Now, maybe that's what your conscience does, and good luck trying to control it.
This is very anti-Nietzsche, isn't it?
Well, I'm a great admirer.
I know you are. That's why I made the point. It's very opposite to his philosophy.
But so Jung embarked on a lengthy critique of Nietzsche, and it's part of his work that isn't well known, I would say. We'll leave that be, except to say that the psychoanalysts, starting with Freud, well, not really, but popularized by Freud and systematized, showed that we weren't masters in our own psychological house.
Right.
There were autonomous entities,
yes.
And those would be the Greek gods to some degree that operated within us, and we were.
Which is Julian James's point, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
We're in. Yes. I have my problems with James, but as a overarching idea, there's interest in it. Okay, so there are things happening with us and to us in the moral domain that we cannot control. Yeah. And that stunned me when I first learned it as a proposition. It's, oh yes, look at that. Here's one. What are you interested in? Yeah. Well, that grips you. Okay. Number two, what does your conscience bother you about? Okay. That's, you're inadequate by your own standards. Mm-hmm. Now, what adequate would mean, that's a different question, but it's defined negatively by conscience.
Yes.
And then better, there's one that I said I would lay out three. You can look at Jean Piaget's work on developmental psychology.
On the development of the subject, yes.
He was a genetic epistemologist.
Yes,
and what he wanted to do was, this is what he wanted to do. He wanted to unite science and religion. That was his goal. And he wanted to look at the empirical development of values. And what he concluded, at least in part, was that a moral stance that's better than a previous moral stance does all the things that the previous moral stance does, plus something else.
Yes. Yes.
And you can say the same thing as a scientific theory.
I remember I had a great, I loved Piaget, and his observation was so empirical, of course.
Yes, absolutely.
Of the development of the child and not quite the theory of mind, that wasn't his thing, but similar developments and signposts where people become aware of self.
Okay, so now Piaget looked specifically at the development of morality, and he was one of the first people to emphasize the importance of games. Yeah. And what he showed was that at 2 years old, let's say, a child can only play a game with him or herself. Yeah. But at 3, both children can identify an aim and then share it in a fictional world. And so that's partly pretend play and the beginnings of drama, and then cooperate and compete within that domain. Yeah. And then what happens, and the game theorists have shown this, is that out of games, morality emerges. Yeah. So I'll give you an example, and this is a crucial example. So if you pair juvenile rats together, the males, they have to play. They have to rough and tumble play because their prefrontal cortexes don't develop properly if they don't. Anyways, they have to play. You pair a big rat and a little rat, teenage rats together, and the big rat will stomp the little rat. Yeah. First encounter. So then you say power determines hierarchy. Yeah. Okay, but then you pair the rats multiple times. Like 50. Yeah. Then if the big rat doesn't let the little rat win 30% of the time, the little rat will stop inviting him to play. And so you get an emergent reciprocity, even at the level of the rat.
Yeah. That is, and it's fascinating, isn't it?